Now, Mrs. Lewis Agard, the floor is yours. Over to you. Thank you.
So before we start talking about masculinity and a healthy look at masculinity, we've been hearing this word toxic masculinity being thrown about for the past, particularly past 2-3 years. And I want to unpack that first before we talk about what healthy masculinity looks like. Yeah. And we'll also talk about how we combat this. Now, and I like to say a toxic performance of masculinity, because for the past 3 years, because we've put toxic and masculinity together, a lot of people get this image that masculinity is toxic. And I really want us to kind of unpack that notion. So toxic masculinity is a really rigid and harmful performance of masculinity. Is this public performance that promotes male entitlement, male domination, and aggression. And these notions of masculinity assert males, a male conquest and control of women and children, and a kind of belief around male supremacy. These behaviors could have really negative impacts on men themselves, but also the relationships that they have with women, children, and even in their professional relationships. So before we go into this, I want to talk to, and the moderator talked about these traditional characteristics of masculinity. And I want us to kind of image how we were raised. And boys and girls were raised with these separate, in these separate types of boxes of men are supposed to be strong and courageous and be a breadwinner and all those things. And women are supposed to be soft and gentle and delicate. Yes, and from the time a baby comes out of the mother's womb, we wrap the baby in either a pink blanket or blue blanket, and that's the beginning of us saying to boys and girls, these are our social expectations of you. Yeah. So we're going to look at really what happens to boys and why this could also be some of these notions of men are supposed to be the breadwinners and the protectors and the providers and the strong, tough kind of people, why this could be toxic sometimes. Yes, so please note, before I move forward, I want to say that of course, all traits associated with masculinity are not toxic. So that's not what we're saying. Men are not toxic. So I want to make sure that we make that clear. And masculine traits are actually not only reserved for men. Okay? So what are these traits that we're saying that are toxic? So there's this way that we pressure men and boys to kind of assume a sense of mental toughness. Like, I am not emotionally affected by anything. And then the only emotional response I have to shame, pain, embarrassment is anger. Yes? And then this sense of physical domination, using your physical attributes for control, whether it's physical control in the relationships that looks like domestic violence, or even taking up space. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. Other toxic performances of masculinity is the lack of accountability. Men are not supposed to be wrong. Yes, and if they're proven to be wrong, they will never take accountability for it. Yes, performance of self-sufficiency. I got here by myself. I did this by myself. I don't need help. Anybody could relate to when it happens with me and my husband when we got together, and we are definitely lost. And I see somebody, and I say, let's ask that person directions. No. I'm going to find it on my own. Yes. And then emotional insensitivity, the inability to show compassion and empathy towards others. So why this toxic performance of masculinity? Boys and men have been really socialized and pressured, I want to say, into this public performance of masculinity. So we, for a long time, boys grew up hearing, big boys don't cry, act like a man, use your man voice, toughen up. And all of these things are preparing boys to act out their manhood in a certain kind of way that doesn't show softness, gentleness, and vulnerability. So I wanted to show you a quick video. And although this video is based on men and boys in North American society, I think that there's some of it, some of the information in the video we could relate to. So let me just cue in this video.
Stop with the tears.
Don't cry.
Pick yourself
Are you all
up.
seeing
Stop
the
with your
video?
emotions.
Don't be a pussy.
Don't let nobody disrespect you.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth
Nobody
shut.
likes a tattletale.
Bros come before hoes.
Don't let your woman run your
You
life.
admit.
What a fag.
Get laid. Do something.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Grow some balls.
The three most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man.
We've constructed an idea of masculinity in the United States that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity, so we make them go prove it all the time.
Within their peer group culture, each of them is posturing based on how the other boys are posturing, and what they end up missing is what they each really want, which is a closeness.
In good times, guys are like really close to each other, but when things get a little bit worse, you're on your own.
From middle school, I had 4 really close friends. Once I kind of went into high school, I struggle finding people I can talk to because I feel like I'm not supposed to.
So as you heard from the video, that boys and men get constant messages about how to be a man. We see it in music. We see it we hear it in music. We see it in our movies. We hear it in our fairy tales about men being conquerors. So even in movies like The Hulk that I grew up on, TV shows, this nice this passive man, for him to get control, he has to turn into this green monster who only knows anger. And this green monster happens to be the hero of the show. We talk about men being conquerors and even hero worship them and not even thinking of the trail of blood and damage that they leave behind. But the fact that they were able to display their masculinity is the only thing that we reward and we take account of. So toxic masculinity has an impact. There are unhealthy expectations that we have on men, and we put financial pressure on men because they have to be providers, because they have to be protectors, because they have to be the breadwinners. And then there's this overburden for women in domestic responsibilities because men don't have to do that kind of thing. And then we have this fear-based relationship with men and children because they're supposed to be so tough and strong. And you'll hear many mothers say, wait till your father get home, meaning that he is going to be the enforcer of punishment. And then it creates relationships that are only based on transactions because we see men as the center of the holders of money. Then our relationships with men are based on how much money we can get from them. Yeah. And then, of course, there's this assumption that men could be inherently dangerous to women and children, so that we see a man at this street corner, we make assumptions of how he could attack us, how he could rape us. We think about when a man and a woman, when their relationship ends and they have children, that the woman automatically gets access to the care of the children because we think that the man could be potentially dangerous to the children. So all those notions that we have about men and masculinity really hurts men. And we talk a lot about how it hurts women, particularly in relationships with men, but it hurts men from being the full beings that they could be. So how do we combat this toxic sense of masculinity? Of course, we have to break the cycle of how we raise boys in the kind of the same way when we were looking at how women were marginalized, and we started to do things differently for girls to make sure that we break that glass ceiling for girls. We have to do that for boys. We have to rethink what kind of toys we give boys. We usually give them a gun and a car, so something to destroy you with. something so that you can show that you have possessions. What about giving boys tea sets and dolls to teach them the sense of nurturing and taking care of? Yes? So let's do the same for boys that we have done for girls. Yes? Let's create safe spaces for men to talk about their experience about this performance, because it has been toxic for a lot of men. And because we haven't built the emotional language, number one, they feel very ashamed to talk about it, and they don't feel safe to talk about it. Reevaluate how we assess femininity. Toxic masculinity plays up against the assumption that femininity is weak. So that when we see men with feminine qualities, we don't value them. And we don't value women because we see them as weak. Yes? Consider that both men can have masculine and feminine characteristics. That a whole, healthy, full man can have feminine characteristics along with masculine characteristics. Just as we have biologically, both men and women have estrogen and testosterone, because to create balance, the same thing we can do with masculinity and femininity. And we evaluate now, of course, it's a faith-based platform we are in here. How we interpret some of the messages that we see in the Bible. I mean, I'm leaving one example, and then we talk about Adam's stewardship, and we use the words rule over, domination, yes? And if you read it again, I am not sure if it was God's intent for Adam to rule over the birds and the flowers and the trees, and that notion of ruling over and dominating, we see the impact that we have in climate change, yes? And if it is that we use the word take care of and nurture, how we would have done things differently of how we treat the planet, but also how we treat men and children. Yeah? And that's the end. I know we will take questions at the end of all the presentations. So if any questions, let me just jot it down and I will answer after the presentation. I'm sorry for all those mix-ups.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mrs. Lewis-Akard. We will now move quickly on to the second presentation by Mr. Liverpool.
I want to say thanks to Nadine. I really enjoyed the presentation. I'm certain that the 50+ persons on would have also benefited from it. Much of what I have to present will build and reinforce what Nadine has so well communicated to us. I am saying hello to everyone from Montserrat. I'm here promoting gender equality, working with men and boys, because the work, as we know, entails addressing a regional challenge. All right, so I just want to start off by saying, and Nadine would have mentioned it, I want to start off by saying that masculinities does not mean men. Masculinities does not equal men. And I think that is important because oftentimes people get in an uproar and they say, well, you're saying that all men are toxic and all men are bad. So that's the first thing I want to say, that masculinity does not equal men. Masculinities refer to ideas that we collectively hold about what it means to be a man in any given society. And it changes based on the society that you are. So even within the Caribbean, you know, even though we have this common history, when you go to different islands, you get these different nuances about what it means to be a man. But there are a lot of similarities. And it changes with time as well, these ideas of masculinity. So because they are ideas, masculinity therefore is not real. It is an abstract concept because it's an idea, it's ideas. And I push the boundary even further and I ask, do men need a concept of masculinity to be a good man. I push that boundary even further, but we could address that later on. But even though it's an abstract concept, there are real consequences. And Nadine would have shared some of these real consequences. And these real consequences are rooted in the idea that masculinity is valued higher than femininity. Or, to put it another way, femininity is inferior to masculinity. That's the general idea. And children embody this from very young. So you hear boys teasing other boys and saying things such as, "You're running like a girl." And when we get a bad drive from a man, other men say, "You're driving like a woman," because those things are inferior. To drive like a man means to drive well. To drive like a woman means it's inferior. So men and masculinity are valued more in societies, not just in Trinidad and Tobago and the Caribbean, but around the world, more than women and girls. I said that yesterday at the secondary school here in Montserrat, and one student disagreed with me. And he said, "That's not true, because I feel like women and girls," well, he said girls, "I feel like girls get more." And I said to the class at the time, I said, let's do an exercise. And this is an exercise I do with different groups. And I'm sure if I do it with this group, the results will be the same. I say, quickly, call out names of Caribbean leaders that come to your mind. And they started to call out names, different names, their prime minister, Antigua and Barbuda prime minister, their past prime ministers. And I was writing it down on the board, and we made a long list. They called out people like Bob Marley, a long list. And I'm sure if I do it with this group, the result will be the same. And I said, okay, let's go through this list and count how many women in the list. And we had a list of about 25 names, and there were about 4 women in the list. Because our ideas of leadership, and Nadine would have spoken about it when we talk about these ideas that are especially reinforced by our religious traditions as well, where we say men are supposed to be the leaders and the head of the homes and the head of society. So we see there that those ideas create that sort of imbalance in society. As a matter of fact, and those are not just something I'm saying, in 2020, research was done and it was found that 25% of parliamentarians across the world were women. You know, when we look at earnings and the gender pay gap, we see that across the world, women make 77 cents for every $1 that men make. And this is within the same profession and the same job types. An interesting case study is Leonel Messi, right? Some persons who are sports fans may know who Leonel Messi is, right? Some people say he's the greatest of all times. You know, he used to play for a club called FC Barcelona. And in 2017, when he was at FC Barcelona, his annual salary was $84 million. And that is unimaginable. Now, I know what 84 TT dollars is. I even know what 84 EC dollars is now, right? But $84 million is unimaginable. So people were wondering, okay, if a male footballer is making this, maybe we could compare. We could compare and see what the best female footballer is making, to see where it is. And that was a hard thing to do, to find a female footballer who was making close to that. So then the researchers said, well, okay, let's combine the salaries, the annual salaries of women footballers, and see how many we will get. Researchers had to combine, listen to this, they had to combine the annual salaries, and these are the top women footballers from the 6 top women football leagues in the world. Researchers had to combine 1,600 and 84 salaries in order to get $42 million. That's just half of what one man is making. So we see there the valuing of men over women. And some people say, well, it's the economics of sports. But is it the economics of sports? Or, you know, it's a chicken and egg situation. Is it the economics of sports, or is it our preferences that would have informed who we prefer to pay more and who we value more in society? Another area where we see these real consequences is in the home when it comes to domestic chores and childcare. So the research that was done, and this is research that was done before COVID, the situation has since been magnified after COVID. Research done by UN Women across 83 countries of the world showed that women perform 4 to 10 times as much housework as men. They spend 4 to 10 times the amount of time that a man spends on household chores: cooking, cleaning, washing, ironing, taking care of the elderly within the home, taking care of children within the home, when compared to men. And this is even women who worked outside of the home. 4 to 10 times. And those are all the real consequences of these abstract ideas of what it means to be a man. And these consequences, like I say, are sustained by this gender inequality. So how do we address it? And I'm reinforcing Nadine's presentation here. So first, what we have recognized in our work is that most men, and this includes me, because it requires honesty. Most men, most of us, have learned to be men in very unhealthy ways. And if we are recognizing that, it means that we need healing and inner work. And that requires vulnerability, which again is something that real men are not vulnerable, right? A real man don't cry, right? So it goes against the grain. So it requires that inner work for men to do, but also for us who are involved in this work to create those safe and brave spaces where men can do that and not feel judged. It is important for men to listen to women. Again, that is something that the cultural views don't promote among men. It's important for men to listen to women, to understand how our values and how our speech and our actions affect women. Because sometimes we do things and we say, nah, I had a man once tell me, you know, that it is his right to suit women and catcall women. It is his right, and women supposed to feel good because he complimented them. So in his mind, he's not doing anything wrong. So it's important for men to listen to women, to understand how things that we grew up thinking are normal cause harm and hurt to other people. It's important as well that men hold other men accountable. And what that means is that we model the right behavior, but also if people who are close to us are saying things that are hurtful, doing things that are hurtful and sexist and misogynistic, that we call them out on it. You know, we tell them, hey, that is wrong, call them out, but also call them in and say, I want to explain to you why it is wrong, right? So calling out, calling in. And it's also important that we share the care, right? Promundo, which is an organization, an international NGO, they produce a lot of work around men and boys, and they produce a State of the World's Fathers report every 2 years. And that's a recurring recommendation. And what they say is that they're encouraging men to spend 50 minutes a day on household chores and domestic tasks, caring for children. 50. Increase your workload in the home as a man by 50 minutes. When I read it, I started doing it because it provides something tangible, you know, something measurable. It's not just saying, hey man, all you have to do better. You know, 50 minutes. Spend 50 minutes every day on doing things within the home. And things that, don't say, well, I'll go and cut the grass, because traditionally, that's the things that we do. Things that we won't traditionally do. Sweeping, washing wares, changing pampers, those types of things that traditionally people say, oh no, that's not man work, that's for women to do. 50 minutes. And that will bring us closer to some sort of equality within the home. And it's important, this is important because it's important for women, but it's also important for men because it results in improved well-being. When we start to look at new ways that we can be men, you know, Nadine would have shared that picture with Hulk there. And, you know, really anger is only the only legitimate emotion that many men believe that they can show. We are unable to express the full range of human emotion because some of them we believe is being like a girl or being like a woman. So it's good for our own emotional and social well-being. And it improves our relationships with women, if we have children, if we are fathers, our relationships with our children, and also our relationships with other men. So these ideas of masculinity is good for men to adopt, and it benefits society as a whole. Thank you very much.
Let us move quickly now on to Archdeacon Steve West. Father West, Archdeacon West, sorry, could you continue with your presentation, please? Thank you.
Right, I'll start here with my definition of masculinity, and I want to thank Nadine and Kevin for their contributions. I got some ideas for myself from Kevin and the 50 minutes. Yeah, so masculinity, I saw a number of different definitions, but this is the one I selected: a set of attributes, behaviors, and roles associated with men and boys. And the writer went on to say that some of these behaviors are influenced by cultural and historical factors. My premise this evening is that the attributes of healthy masculinity are influenced by the Creator, by God, who created us equally and gave us certain attributes. So God said, let us make humankind in our image according to our likeness. So God created humankind in his image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. So that we are called to reflect the image of God. An image is what one presents to the world. So if we are to be true to masculinity and femininity, we are called to reflect the image of whoever or whatever we perceive God to be. In our context as Christians, we might very well ask, so what image does God present to the world? And one of the individuals who would talk to God as a man spoke to his friend was Moses. And so in the book of Exodus, Moses gives us a description of, well, God gives Moses a description of God's self. And it is recorded for us in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6. Moses was there on the mountain with the 2 tablets, prepared to receive the 10 commandments, and God passed. He was not allowed to see God's face. He was only able to see God's back. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed. So the Lord is describing himself, or God's self. The Lord, a God gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. So this is the image that God presents to the world, a God who is gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness. So that if we are to understand that we are made in the image of God, then we are called to reflect these attributes: gracious, generosity of spirit, kind, courteous, unselfish, compassionate, a deep awareness of other people's situation, meaning trying to put ourselves in their place to feel what they feel so that we can respond in the way that we would have liked somebody to respond if we were in that place. So it's being able to understand what others are feeling, taking the time to do so. Slow to anger. And, we heard, when we're talking about toxic masculinity, one of the signs of that is anger, and anger that comes to the fore very quickly. But what we are called to reflect from this God who made us in God's image is that we are slow to anger. And there are occasions when, particularly when there is injustice, that we are called to be enraged. But the difference, of course, is how we express that anger, how we convert it into some kind of productive or meaningful activity. Love. John tells us in his first letter that whoever does not love does not know God, for God is love. So if we are made in God's image, then we are called to love. And if we study the Bible, we will see that God's love is expressed in two very distinct ways. Eros, that is the passion, the strong desire for, and God has a strong desire for a relationship with each of us. And we are called to have a strong desire for a relationship with God. As the psalmist says, as a deer pants for the water brook, so does my soul pant for you. And so it's a strong feeling that we must have this relationship because it is what is best for us. And then there is the agape love, the love that was demonstrated in Jesus in his ministry of teaching and preaching and healing, and which Paul describes for us in 1 Corinthians 13. And we have all the characteristics of that love: patient, kind, not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. And as we reflect on those, think about it being expressed in an individual. If this kind of love is expressed in an individual interacting with people, then you recognize that there is a healthy interaction. There will be a healthy relationship. Does not insist on its own way, is not irritable or resentful, does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth, bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And Paul says that love never ends. So that we need to remind ourselves that we are made in the image of this God who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, steadfast in love, and also faithfulness. And that has to do with being loyal and honest and showing integrity. One of the big characteristics of God that we will find as we study the Bible is that when God makes a promise, it is as good as done. When God says and gives God's word, it happens, whether we believe that it is impossible or not, it happens. And so God's faithfulness is expressed in the way that God always keeps a promise. God always looks after the welfare of God's people. And so if we are to reflect this image that of God with which we are created, then we should strive as far as possible for honesty, integrity, and loyalty in our relationships. So I ask the question, what does healthy masculinity look like? When we are able to reflect the image of God in our everyday experiences, when we are gracious and compassionate. And of course, we realize, as Kevin said, these things have to come from within. You can't fake graciousness. It has to come from the heart. And so, slow to anger. St. Paul uses a very interesting phrase that encapsulates this. He says, patient endurance. Patient endurance. Whatever happens, you endure it with patience, and you look to see what good is there in this. And when you're able to do that, it prevents you from, you might still be you might still be enraged, but the way you respond will be much different. And of course, faithfulness. You're given a task to do, you do it to the best of your ability, and you see it through to the end. You make a commitment, you keep that commitment. And if you are unable, then you bring it to the fore and you say, look, I don't think I'm able to do this. So there is honesty, there is integrity in the interactions with others. And what we are simply doing is expressing the virtues by which we were made. We were made in the image of this God who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, showing steadfast love and faithfulness. The question is, how do we do this? Well, we do it by striving to obey that first commandment. A couple of weeks ago, we had it as our gospel passage. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. Now, when God gives us a task, God always gives us the ability to carry out the task. The degree to which we achieve this depends on the effort that we are prepared to make to keep this commandment. And so that is the challenge for us. We have to understand that to know is to love. So if we are to love God with heart and soul and mind and strength, we have to come to know God. And therefore, we have to be prepared, just as we increase the housework by 50 minutes, we have to take the time every day to interact with the Bible so that we come to know and understand and therefore strive to love this God with everything that we have. And we have to understand that since this commandment is first, it is the one that we should endeavor to do first. And God, in God's wisdom, understands that if we try to do this, then the other one, the second one, will fall into its rightful place. We will understand who we are. We know that we will never be perfect reflections of this image. We're not, we're broken. But we will, even in our brokenness, we will love ourselves because we will see ourselves as children of God, individuals for whom Christ died. God so loved the world that God would give God's Son. And so as we build that relationship with God, as we strive to love God, we understand who we are. And our physical abilities or disabilities, our social position, none of those things will be as important as understanding that I am a special child of God, created in God's image. And when I look around me, who do I see? I see other special children of God. All of us made in the image of this God who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, love, and faithfulness. And of course, God in God's graciousness and generosity have given us the gift of the Holy Spirit to help us to reflect that image of God in which we were created. And notice the coming together of the characteristics. Paul says the fruit of the Spirit, if we allow the Holy Spirit to direct our lives and we continue to build this relationship with God, the fruit of the Spirit, love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, generosity, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Compare that with gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, self-control, love, and faithfulness. You see, it all comes together if we only come to know and understand what God desires of us. So God has given us the gift of God's Holy Spirit so that we can reflect those characteristics which demonstrate that we are made in the image of God. And when we are able to do that, we will never be perfect at it. But we will get the A for effort, and the effort will make a whole lot of difference in our relationships, in the way we see ourselves as men, and the way we see women, and the way we see other men, and the way we deal with people who might be different from us in terms of their origin and their ethnicity and their social standing and all of those things. We would be able to recognize, hey, that is another individual that is made in the image of God, the God I am trying to love, the God who created me with the same intention that I would reflect God's image. There is a warning, however, for us. And I believe that the biggest threat to healthy masculinity is the ego. An inflated feeling of pride in your superiority to others. While we have to have a sense of who we are and be able to reflect that, everybody else has the same privilege, the same image that they have to project. So we have to beware. And St. Paul puts it this way. He says, "For by the grace given to me, I say to every one of you, not to think of yourself more highly than you ought to think." And I always find it very fascinating that Paul did not say not to think of yourself highly. He says more highly than you ought. So since we are made in the image of this God who is love and gracious and compassionate and slow to anger, we can think of ourselves highly. But all of us must think of ourselves highly. And I cannot think of myself more highly than you, because God has given all of us gifts, different gifts, because they're different tasks to perform. And God has a plan and a purpose for each of us. Different purpose, different plan, because we are different. But when you put the whole thing together, you get the picture of the complete jigsaw puzzle. So we have to be warned that really beware of the ego, which will want to give us that sense of being superior to others. In the eyes of the Creator, we are all equal. So, what does healthy masculinity look like? Well, if we are able to understand and reflect the image of this great and awesome God who created us, we simply will have to look in the mirror. Thank you.